Good afternoon. For those of you that don't know me, which I would imagine is probably very few, but I am Kathy Dubois, and I am the lead nurse planner for our Nursing Continuing Education Provider Unit. So if you have any questions at all and it's not clear how to get contact hours, go next door when you're done, and we'll be there, and we will certainly give you your certificate. But I'd like to welcome you back. Because I know that this is getting towards the end of a very busy day. I hope you guys have really enjoyed it. But I am most excited. This is probably the most exciting part of the day for me because I get to introduce a very dear colleague, Jeff Hooper. And Jeff is our Director of Biomedical Engineering and a true champion of nurses. He works with us collaboratively. When I first came to nursing education, he was there and helping us transition to the East Inpatient Tower and really leading the way as far as helping technology help us. And he has continued that work, has a dynamite department to help him. And so it's very exciting for me. So I'll tell you a little bit. I have a little official information about Jeff. He's been practicing as a biomedical engineer for 25 years. He holds a BS and an MS and is currently a candidate for a PhD in biomedical engineering. His PhD dissertation is on the topic of using data to proactively identify clinical deterioration in acute care pediatric patients. He's been the manager of Children's Biomedical Department since 2005, and prior to that, he held leadership roles in the Bon Secours Health System, managing the biomedical engineering program and capital management program for their 26 hospital system. He has published on several occasions in the area of clinical equipment management, as well as referenced on a regular basis for best practices in the area of medical equipment management. And it is my pleasure and honor to introduce to you Jeff Hooper.
Thanks, everyone. So it's an honor to have the opportunity to visit with everyone today. And over the next 45 minutes or so, hopefully I can share a little bit about how the Department of Biomedical Engineering has, up until this point, and kind of what our future is around the area of what the title of the presentation. And Kathy asked if I could, we're kind of talking back and forth during different opportunities about some of the things that are happening within biomedical engineering and on conversations around supporting magnet. It became more and more apparent that there were a lot of opportunities to share what some folks may be aware of and some folks may not. So today, hopefully, my conversation is going to be focused on data. And as most of you know, the world of medical equipment is rapidly changing. And a little bit of background, biomedical engineering here at the hospital, our primary role is to fix stuff when it breaks. And in addition to that, we do some regulatory compliance, some annual inspections, kind of the oil change of the medical equipment world to make sure your little sticker on your Jiffy Lube window is correct. We are the ones who slap the stickers on all the different pieces of medical equipment. But with that growing responsibility of fixing the medical equipment when it breaks and performing that regulatory, a couple of things have happened over the last 10, 15 years in the world of medical equipment. Number one is the amount of equipment, specifically on our critical care areas, has drastically increased. As our patients have gotten sicker and the equipment becomes more advanced, the equipment volume has increased, the type of equipment has increased, and the ability of the equipment to store information is dramatically increased. And that network ability, so that it's not just one machine doing one function and then another machine doing another function. The equipment has really evolved into several machines that talk to each other, sometimes within that same manufacturer silo. Sometimes those equipments cross silos, and you might have a ventilator talking to a physiologic monitor, or an ECMO talking to an electronic medical record, and all that data that's flowing back. So with that integration of that data, it's really changed the way that we have to support the medical equipment and the resources that we have and the needs. And what that's evolved into is, in addition to our intensive care units, is our operating rooms as well. Wouldn't want to leave them out. Is that the amount of equipment it's drastically growing, and they're becoming systems. so that we don't just have a infusion pump. We have a system of infusion pumps where they all talk together, and we work with our nursing and our pharmacy teams to build a drug library to make sure that drug library can get to all the different devices, and then all that information when those devices are touched and they do what they're supposed to do, all that data becomes stored. In order for all that to happen, and that's happening right now, we have about 11 systems that we're managing kind of outside of the Bayer Institute telemedicine realm around systems that integrate infusion pumps, physiologic monitors, neurology systems, inpatient video surveillance, temperature refrigeration monitoring, a lot of different systems where all this equipment, and then we're also doing charting. The other thing that's unique to data, and this is a really bad picture, I apologize for that, but I wanted to put it up there because it's important to something we're going to talk about, is there's also a new trend in pediatrics that we're monitoring with physiologic monitors more and more patients in an acute care environment. So not just in the ICU world do we have 30 plus devices per equipment. Any given day, any patient in our acute care is also going to be hooked up to a continuous physiologic monitor. And that then opens up a whole other world of more and more data and the connectivity necessary for that. So one of the big things that we wouldn't be able to do anything if it weren't for, Kathy mentioned, we have a wonderful team here at Biomedical Engineering, and we have one team member who really has driven this. Some of you may know her, may not, but it's Ginny Amendola. She's the one peeking through that data closet there, and her main focus is a data analyst. And it's her vision that's taken all of this into kind of a useful format so that we can provide it to different users. But it is a whole team. So here's some of the systems that we kind of currently already are grabbing data from. We've got physiologic monitors, we've got MRI monitors, we've got ventilators, we've got cerebral oximeters, anesthesia machines, pumps, nurse call video. That's just to name a few of those different systems. And all of those are storing data 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. All that use model from all those patients can go somewhere. So one of the things that we've tried to do here at Children's is to be proactive, is that somehow in the research forum, this information is going to be valuable to somebody at some point. So as these data streams became evident, we started creating mechanisms so that we could actually store it and identify it and access it for later, so that if some creative individuals were interested in that, they could go and access that. But some of the things that we're doing that aren't research related to that data, kind of the more day-to-day relationships associated with data, is charting. Is that all those data elements for the vital signs and hemodynamics are going into the electronic medical record. And we do that in our, as you all know, in our intensive care units here. We do it in our anesthesia areas. Our second big area around data and the movement of information from one machine to another is in the area of alerting. So positive or not positive, but for the last 7 years, Children's has been sending alert data from physiologic monitors and ventilators and code blue and nurse call systems to a secondary device. We've recently upgraded that with our partnership with the Bayer Institute and Cerner to send, instead of from a kind of a more archaic blue ASCOM phone to a more updated iPhone. And within that comes a whole slew of issues and problems. But again, it's an example of moving that data from one area to the next and the information that we can get from that. And then the last area is this data storing for analysis. Now, analysis can mean research. We use it on a regular basis, on a day-to-day basis with our department for risk management. So someone may say, hey, we had an incident on a pump. Kathy does the central nursing orientation on the pumps right before me, and I do it on alarms and physiologic monitors. And she always jokes around when she intros, and she says, there's never a problem with the pump, it's always a problem with the user. And the reality is that's true, and we can sometimes, most of the time, prove that because we have this data that comes from the pump that says, no, you didn't push that button, you didn't program it, that we can pull all that historical information back and be able to actually kind of recreate this little CSI investigation. We can do that for ventilators, we can do that for infusion pumps, we can do that for physiologic monitors, and we're called on them almost on a daily basis to pull that information for those reasons. Alarm management is Heather is here, and Heather has been really the champion of alarm management for a long time, and really for, it started several years back kind of for the negative reasons, and now we're on the positive, is trying to take something negative. But that example where we're taking alerts from an inpatient environment and we're sending that information over to another user's phone so that they can be notified. We've now been made aware that there's a clinical condition that is called alarm fatigue. Joint Commission has actually designated as one of the most important safety initiatives. It's a national safety patient goal or national patient safety goal. And alarm fatigue basically is, hey, the fire alarm's going off and everybody's running around like they don't care. Alarm fatigue happens in medical equipment, and there's an estimate that somewhere around 100,000 patients a year are dying in hospitals because of alarm fatigue. So Heather and I have been aware of alarm fatigue for 10 plus years here at Children's, but now that this is front and center, a lot more people are focused on doing things to reduce that alarm fatigue. So we have a clinical alarms management committee that looks at new strategies, but that alarms committee would really be not very helpful. Here's kind of a diagram of how all the different data flows from the different pieces of equipment. Here's kind of the more complicated one. I don't want to spend too much time, but for any of the inpatient nurses who say, hey, we have this and it never works, here's a diagram of all the different things that can go wrong, why it can't work. It's not just one thing. It makes it pretty complicated just for an alert to get from a phone to the end. But one of the big values that data proves, I'm going to jump forward here, is that it gives us decision-making tools for the clinical alarms management. I don't know how readable this is, but this is an example of a report that goes to the clinical alarms committee. It tells how many alarms happened by color code, by unit, per day. And that counts are important. We used to be able to get response time information as well by pulling information from two disparate systems. So we could tell that an alarm went off, a nurse came in the room at that moment in time, and that could be used for qualitative purposes. We're using that for call bell response time, and that's a big patient satisfier. So again, some of this data elements are coming in lots of different places. And hopefully we're using these to drive decisions as well. Here's kind of an example of code blues. Here's again a data that goes from our team that Ginny produces and sends to our PERC committee on a regular basis. And then another example of alerts. Just again, sheer volume, but it points out some things that sometimes leads to some decision-making tools. And this is a good example just from our last clinical alarms committee. One of the issues is that when a call bell is pushed inside a patient's room, is that the UCA, the secretary on the unit, has a choice to send that call to a registered nurse or to send it to a patient care technician. And ideally, the majority of those calls would be sent to patient care technicians so that the RNs wouldn't be pulled out of their workload. This data shows us that almost on a 9-to-1 ratio, those UCAs are sending those calls to RNs electronically. So that was kind of an aha moment, something we could give to our leadership that could make a change. So it's it is real, and it does impact. I mentioned the incident investigations on the pumps. This is a good example, is that someone will call and say, hey, this pump, it was supposed to pump at X volume. The bag was empty before it was supposed to be empty, and a lot of things could go wrong with that. Usually the first thing is that the pump malfunction. Again, pumps usually don't break. But I call them little BMWs when I do the nursing education, is that this medical equipment is so expensive that what we do to fix it really is a small part. But the manufacturers, in order to get through FDA, they don't naturally aren't going to make too many mistakes. But again, it gives us that example of say, well, the pump actually did infuse this much, and we can show that because it rotated this much time, and we can keep track of all those volumes. And we can go back to pharmacy and say, well, maybe your bags aren't necessarily filled every single time when you get to the floor. And sometimes that leads to some confrontational, but at least it gives us data to drive those decisions. Around physiologic monitors, sometimes these aren't as positive in the sense that it's usually around something that's pretty bad's happened, and they'll call and say, hey, we've had a traumatic event. We want you to go back and pull the historical information around a physiologic monitor, tell us what happened, and we have tools that can do that. The manufacturer has some tools, that allow us to store some data for a small amount of period of time. But Ginny and our other members of the biomed team have then taken that tool and then kind of in this research format, just by realizing there's a value for all this information, moved it over to another kind of storage format that can be accessed and picked at for long term. So now we can go back forever and look at anything from 2004. We can go back and look at an incident and say, no, that didn't have an alarm at that time, or that patient's blood pressure was this, or we can actually get quality waveforms if the clinician actually wants to go in and do some analysis of that signal processing. All that data is being stored. Getting more and more complicated to store that data as the volume of information gets, but as data costs get cheaper, it actually is pretty reasonable, pretty easy to store this information. I mentioned this. We also present data. We have an alerts review task force that's been in business for, probably 6 years at least since we rolled out the electronic medical record. And part of the original alerts review task force goal was to look at the alerts that popped up from Cerner when someone ordered a medication that didn't match the drug library. Jenny had the vision, along with Dr. Jacobs and some others, Patrice Johnson and some others in the Bayer Institute, to say, hey, when we roll out these new pumps, and Kathy was a part of that as well, is that when we roll out these new pumps, we have all this data, and it's very similar to alerts that are popping up from Cerner. We want to be able to find out. So the big deal with pumps and alerts is there's 3 main pieces of information you want to know about on pumps. One is there's a hard limit. So we got this drug library and someone tries to infuse morphine at such and such a dose at such and such a rate. If pharmacy builds a library, upper and lower limits, if it goes above it, hard limit says nope, no way, you're not going to be able to infuse that. Soft limits are it lets you do it, but it beeps and keeps track of that beep. So that's valuable information as we go back to the pharmacy team and that alerts review task force team to be able to make decisions about that drug library, about the drugs they're keeping, about practice. And then the big data point that we really didn't think was going to be a big data point, which again drove practice probably somewhat almost to the nth degree, was this basic infusion idea. And again, just to kind of use examples of where data is really, it might not be high tech and it might not be super sophisticated, but one of the things we found as we were dumping and pulling all this data from the pumps, from these repositories and running pumps and bringing them back to the alerts review task force, and us as kind of engineers and nerds and geeks not really knowing what it means, and someone says, hey, what's that basic infusion number? Well, that's how many times someone's bypassed that drug library to just infuse it the way you used to in 1975. And I'm going to infuse morphine at 100 milliliters an hour, no matter how much there's in there, no matter what the limit is, and that obviously completely defeats the purpose of using the smart pumps. And that led to, as you can see, these types of reports. I should have put a slide in here just to show how dramatic the practice change from this information based on people like Kathy and others who went out to the floors and educated the nursing leadership to say, hey, stop doing this. Is there a reason why you're doing this? Why are you doing this? So now our basic infusion rate went from about, I think it was about a third to less than about a tenth now in that range as to the number of times that we're actually bypassing. So again, just an example of having the vision to save this data, putting it in the right hands of the right people can be used to drive decisions. All right, so before I get into this slide, I'll chat for a second about there are some physician clinical leaders who have learned, and that hopefully through conversations like this and the more and more we share, it's not as publicly aware that we have all of this data for these different devices, and I want to make it more and more aware. But as individuals find on it, we're working with the phytology department, who is heavily engaged. As soon as they found out that we have this data, we're using it to analyze on a really high level this clinical deterioration. And as I learn, and as I talk to my peers in the intensive care unit, and as I learn more and more about alarm fatigue, clinical deterioration of be able to identify that in advance is kind of the holy grail of always obviously has been the holy grail of medicine, is we want to identify something before something bad happens. And the data really, and all this equipment that we have, is really set up to do that, right? It's supposed to beep when something bad happens, but there are these finite incidences that the machine's set up that if the ventilator goes above this center, or the pump goes below this, or the pump is done, or the vital sign goes above this, those are finite things. And you as caregivers respond to those in finite things. And you don't look at the whole big picture as to what's happening to all that data. So as we find out that there's data available for multiple systems, some of the pathology department's really been, and Dr. Sue in critical care, working with Dr. Govindan, have been instrumental in realizing that information from an EEG machine and information from a physiologic monitor and information from a ventilator and information from a pump and a video camera, and you put it all together, you get a ton of information and a lot to be able to analyze that. So they're doing that, and we're helping build that. And there's Dr. Susan involved in a study in CIC right now looking at vital signs and hemodynamic data that looks at using data, and this is kind of the transition into the future of where we're using it from a research perspective. Dr. Sue's study is looking at clinical deterioration in the CICU 24 hours pre a cardiac arrest with the hope that there's something that happens. Now, that study is more of a signal analysis. You have your P, your QRS, and your T wave from your ECG, and then trying to analyze that electrical component of that ECG to look for something symbolic in that signal. And that got me to talking with Heather and the alarms committee, is that we could use that same theory, take some of the data, and solve one of our bigger problems in acute care medicine. And that's the research that we're going to hopefully be kicking off here real soon. And that is the premises and the hypothesis is if we look at two pieces of two examples, and we have a patient who's in the hospital in an acute care unit, and they're hooked up to a physiologic monitor the whole time, and they go home at the end of their stay, and they're fixed, and everything's all better. And during their stay, their machine might have beeped and bonged a few times around the way, and that's the graph on the left. So if you look at each one of those colors, one is heart rate, one is respiratory rate, one is pulse oximetry, the assumption is that you're going to be within some kind of range, your values are going to fall in that range, and every once in a while something's going to pop out of it, and it's going to be an alarm. Those alarms, for the most part, are false alarms because the patient's fine, they might have moved, the sensor might not have been on right, it might have been something happening in that environment at that time, but there was nothing clinically deteriorating or clinically significant that alarm was happening. There's a school of thought that says, kind of based on Dr. Sue's theory in the ICU, is that, hey, if we're monitoring all these vital signs 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for a patient, and they're continuously being monitored, and we're trying to create Pew scores, and Pew scores are taking continuous information with some intermittent information about the patient's physical abilities and their mental acuity and things like that, putting them all together with a score, those are kind of just snapshots in time. Wouldn't it be neat if we had this continuous monitor in these acute care patients that didn't just alert when someone's heart rate went out of bounds, but told us a story that, hey, something's bad. Hey, this is an alarm, and hey, this is an alarm, but when these two alarms happen, or when the respiratory rate goes up and the pulse ox goes down and the heart rate goes down and the blood pressure goes down, and that happens 2 or 3 times, those may be indicative of something to happen. So we're looking to look at that data and look backwards at it to hopefully have some type of an identifier that says, hey, this is an algorithm that we could be more aware, so that we have these monitor watchers in our acute care units, and their job is to, if they're looking at a screen of alarms, and if this one beeps or bongs, their job is to get that nurse and say, hey, your patient's beeping or bonging, and that nurse is supposed to go in and respond to it. But often, that's just creating to that alarm fatigue, because that nurse has already heard that alarm, they've already gotten that message on their phone, and they've already in their mind said, it's probably a false alarm because mom's in there and they're probably thinking around with this, and they're not responding to it. So if we can give the monitor techs some smarts, some analytics, then they can more appropriately notify the nurses when those things happen with an algorithm. Again, just an example of using data that exists within the devices, and the more thought-provoking, the more questions that get asked, the more pieces of equipment that store the data, the more we'll be able to combine data across different systems and be able to access it for future research studies. So went through that a little bit faster than I thought, but anybody have any discussion or questions that? Yeah, sure.
Hi, I'm Elaine Williams. I'm a research nurse, and the PCA pump, for example, I'm interested in. You mentioned the data is stored. How long? Because, in research, we need the data for about 15 years. So I have a new study, and I have a pump that's a sponsor that's in your department now, and we're working through the kinks. So I'm just wondering, that one question I never got an answer. Like, can you store the data for 15 years?
So everybody heard the question on the web. The question is how long can the data be stored for individual systems? So one is we're limited by whatever that manufacturer sometimes has set up. That sometimes that data is meant to be stored for analytics, and sometimes there's a time limit set for that. And on some times we can export that information and move it into another environment so they can be stored for a longer period. The PCA pumps are in that in-between world right now, is because we're limited to what the manufacturer can store with respect to that pump. There is that ability and that capability to move that data to a secondary device, but the PCA pumps are probably one of those devices that's kind of on the horizon that we haven't been able to do that yet. But that's a great question, and that's the goal, is to be able to do those things. Sure, Nancy.
I have a question about the method sensor.
Mm-hmm.
So you talked about a lot of data that's coming from equipment that's directly attached to the patient. What about sort of at the more systems level, things like the method sensors or some of the pharmacy systems or some of the lab systems? Is that also in there, or is it sort of separated out, or is there a way of looking at them?
Yes, that's a great question. I can't necessarily speak to it because I do live a little bit in my own silo as to the equipment that we touch and that we're aware of that data streams. And hopefully as those silos cross, and that we have an initiative here at Children's called the Bear Institute, and we have an Innovation Institute, and as we understand the value of big data, that electronic medical record or some type of a data warehouse then becomes that repository, so that analytics, and that's really our goal, is what I'm doing is very grassroots as opposed to what other teams are doing within the Bear Institute, is that bigger, larger grassroots or larger data warehousing, and that's the information that can come into that really is the future, and we haven't really embarked too closely on that, but I agree that's a big thing, understanding how often the crash cart's accessed, how often a lab is drawn, how those types of information. Good question.
Going back to that PCA pump, you said moving the data from one environment to the other. Do you mean that it can be stored on a USB or downloaded to a CD? Yeah,
correct. I mean, that's our goal, is that we have some type of an external storage location, whether it's as simple as a spreadsheet or some type of a database where we can grab it from that proprietary vendor environment and then put it over here in a format that is easy enough to access.
So that research pump for Dr. Williams, we can check to see whether it has a port that can be used to download the information.
Correct.
Thank you.
Sure.
It's on. Maybe it's on now. Okay. With some of the care that's shifting into the community and kind of the concept of a patient that is not really admitted or discharged, do you see an increasing role for biomedical engineering in the telehealth and the monitoring that would go on at home, and like some sort of connectivity between the data that would be collected at home and then some sort of trigger?
Yeah, most definitely. That's probably the single most clinically significant, event that's happening around medical equipment, and the transition of moving into telehealth probably over the next 10 years. So there definitely will be an integration. It will ultimately grow into more sophisticated systems, just like medical equipment, is that most home health equipment is a single device, a home health ventilator, a home health glucometer, a bed perhaps. And as it becomes more sophisticated, they then become integrated, and maybe they're being analyzed or monitored by a clinician in a remote environment. And as that happens, then they're going to need to be integrated and connected so that someone can look at that patient's data remotely, whether it's through a computer screen. And as that evolution happens, there's going to be again that data that's going to come out of that. But there's those two worlds have not sparked or skyrocketed. And I think some recent healthcare reimbursement information around telemedicine is going to really change the whole telemedicine. But there's right here within Baltimore, Hopkins started the original VisiQ, which was kind of a remote ICU environment for hospitals in rural areas that didn't have critical care physicians, so that you could have an ICU patient in a small hospital, and you could have some ICU docs over at Hopkins. And that at one point thought that was going to be around the monitoring side was going to be the spark that started the remote telemedicine monitoring. So the technology is there. It's capable. It's aware with the networks and the Wi-Fi's in people's houses. It's more for right now the cost value as to who is watching it. And I think with equipment right now the question is who's going to do it and who's going to pay for it. And I think once that happens, then the remote monitoring will be more. So, and then we as an institution like Children's are going to have to, and in the biomedical engineering department, have to make ourselves more cross-functional with these home health companies that lease and rent this medical equipment to them, because they're going to need to be seamless integrated. So your mom and pop home health company that rents a ventilator isn't maybe going to be sophisticated enough to link that ventilator up to this third-party telemedicine company, who then is going to have a remote viewer who views that information. So they're going to have to rely on someone from the hospital to do that. And we are joined at the hip with the telemedicine group doing those kinds of things at a bigger level, like right now with Holy Cross. And when we want to bring in EEGs from another environment, or we want to bring in an echo study from another environment, is to hook up to that equipment and to get that data to flow. And I think that's definitely in the future. So that's a great question.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? Thank you, Jeff, so much for all you do and for coming out today.